Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, both online and in the Wells Maltings in the wonderful Kiln Room. A very warm welcome to Sea Fever. Sea Fever is North Norfolk's festival of poetry and prose. This is the fourth such festival that we've staged and the very first that we have staged online. I've said hitherto that I very much hoped it would be the last that we would stage online for obvious reasons. However, it's become clear, and this is, as I was saying, number 6 of these events, that spreading the word and providing access to people online has proved a huge success. And when we come onto the glories in May, next May, of Sea Fever 5, when I don't doubt hundreds of people will descend on the Wells Maltings, and we will again be providing an online service. It's a huge privilege this afternoon to introduce you to 3 artists who are local to the area but have national reputations. Harry, Cory, Wright, on my left, in the, what are we wearing, Harry, this evening?
Charcoal's up today, Jim.
Yes, but charcoal. Harry in charcoal is best known as a photographer, and he's known as one of the best landscape photographers working in the United Kingdom at the moment. But his palette, his activities, and his artistic work spreads beyond that. Ionides, on Harry's left, is a sculptor and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Sculptors, and was educated, I noticed with great interest, Polly, at Oxford, where you read zoology.
Correct.
And I thought that was a very natural progression from zoology to being a sculptress.
It opens your eyes.
Indeed. And Polly, who is out of shot at the moment, Sally, who is out of shot at the moment, is of course very well known as a poet in her own right, but also as the biographer of Gertrude Jekyll and Barbara Hepworth. Can I introduce all 3, therefore, and say that I very much hope you enjoy what they have to say this afternoon, and indeed expect. Finally, though, can I say that the whole occasion, the festival, has been brought to you courtesy of Wells Maltings, who are providing this venue for free, and all the speakers and the whole series have given their own time also for free. So thank you all for making this such a success.
Jim, will you mention questions?
Yes, questions.
Anyone online?
Well, yes. Questions from the hall, again, be very welcome at the end of the session, but also questions online are also welcome. Right, ladies and gentlemen, Harry, Sally, and Polly.
Before we lived permanently in Overy, we lived on the Rutland to Leicester border in an idyllic village with thatched roofs and a very red clay soil. And I remember thinking one spring, what an amazing combination the fields of rape with the red soil. And a certain image came to mind. Thank you. You need to know for this poem what a pelt is. A pelt is a covering for a creature or maybe for the earth. Sundry pelts. Red fields hug bare midland slopes, close as the untouchable fox's fur. Rape brings squares of Warhol's Marilyns over and over, the coarse bleached bob of yellow hair. Thank you. Next one. This picture is a drawing by my granddaughter, my eldest granddaughter, when she was about 7. She was with her sister and her mother, my daughter, in the kitchen at a table beneath the window. We were all sitting round together. Now, Daisy had mild cerebral palsy when she was born. She can't still hop or ride a bike, but when she was younger, she had communication difficulties. And she used to draw a lot, and it's one of her drawings. Thank you. So I want you to look carefully at her drawing while I read. Picture of a tableau, the slab of white maple, extends the room to 3 generations, fills most of a page. 2 Stylized girls, triangular bodies, inscrutable grins, float isolated at opposite ends. Daisy, the elder, draws herself slightly bigger, though she no longer is. Behind her, an empty chair, arms like the Brancusi hugs she needs and receives, but aren't enough. Cries strangle the afternoon. Her eyes are harsh as a wounded woman. We'll have to talk, my daughter says. She's back to pin men. Daisy, we all eat together. Where are we all? She rolls the crayon into anonymous, unthreatening gatherings, dances flowers on her picture of a tableau. Everything else against the grain, a hurt that won't be damped, a tummy pain. Thank you. Next slide. This is another poem, an ekphrastic poem. It's written after looking at the picture that George Follard drew when he came back from World War II. He was in the winter line and he was hit, his tank was hit by a shell, and he was blown up 80 miles southeast of Rome, feeling absolutely terrible. He was concussed. He was flown home in terrific pain when he recovered. Walking man. He's leaning back, although he's moving forward. So inclined, he doesn't see the ground ahead of him. As if there's contradiction somewhere in this skinny man in pen and ink, his gaze glazed over, his fuzz of beard smeared on, his hands alarmed, as if the contradiction tilts him back, the part still driven by the wind and beaten by the rain. The sun full on his face, paralyzed by the luck that keeps him going. He's not exactly fragile, though is that, more obsessed by battling the winter line, the line that felled him when the shell hit. The tank brewed up as he was getting out, the pain as he came down, before they stitched him up and bore him home in silence. He landed without a holdall, only the blast inside his head, baggage sticky taped to his brain. With perfect clarity, he sees Monte Cassino, the ruins on the hill, icy mountain ranges, rivers and ravines, a train crying out for endurance. Still, there is courage in his feet, one after the other. So, here's a pastel by my Aunt Ione, aged 22, and it's in our home, a few yards from my computer. Ione was very talented, she was very highly strung and lived for her art. She was also self-critical and unhappy at home. And because she was unhappy, my grandfather sent her on a painting trip with a well-known tutor, Leonard Richmond, and she fell in love with him. She hadn't met a man like him before, as she says. And she went, he asked her to go to Paris, and she went with him after falling completely headlong in love with him. When they came home, his wife, from whom he was estranged, discovered what had happened and got in touch with Ione's father. And he was very, very cross with her. And she was so upset that she went back to St. Ives, where she'd met Richmond, and she jumped off a cliff. Market scene. She's mapping in orange sunshades, opening across her sketch like harvest moons, raising such hopes in her, they create little throbs inside her dream. Étaples, market, she'll call it when she dares to colour in. There's a vertical strip of sky between blocks of building, vivid behind the throb of bartering, banks of food for sale, thrusting hawkers, aproned women in small white caps, and widow's weeds, the endless grief of World War I, a picture already printed in her head. Above all, there's her tutor, His presence brings the very soul of Market closer, for she's never met a man like him to love. For a moment, her yearning comes on like madness. It's like jumping off her moon onto the sun. The next move matters. Let's say it's a high cliff leap. She rests her pencil, sighs. The sketch is ready. She stands and reaches to touch the sky. This buoyant June, she could kiss a stranger.
Thank you, Sally. I've seen this picture in Sally's house, and it is the most beautiful thing, isn't it? It's just, and it's done, it's about that big, perhaps, do you think?
Yeah.
And it just, but it feels such an intimate thing, and it's so warm, and these two big, you feel enclosed by these kind of, these umbrellas of warmth and light. It's a beautiful thing. Next slide, please, Mike. Which is, okay, so I am a photographer. I've done it for a very long time now, since I was about 16. And for the last 25 years, it is now 25, I've been using this camera. Not that particular one, but cameras like that. And in a nutshell, it's I photograph landscape, places. It's what's called a field plate camera. I don't use plate anymore, I use a sheet of film, but it basically indicates that the negative is 10 by 8 inches in size, and particularly these days, it's quite an expensive thing to use. So you only end up using just one sheet, and that in itself kind of brings all sorts of things to the way that I use it. Usually a sort of singularity, because the shutter speeds are usually about a 30th of a second, so incredibly banal. They're rather just a click, you know. So it's nothing. We were just saying earlier on, it's a very, very insignificant moment, but obviously what it has the capacity to do is represent something much bigger. So what I'm looking for all the time is to find these places that are, of beauty, I guess, but just moments of very important, charged sense of belonging. Next one, please, Mike. By which, what I mean, so here, this is a view from Long Hills on Sculptor Head, looking west, and just across the mudflats, which is something that the three of us know quite well. What this camera, I always feel, does, and let me say that the lens that I use is just one, which is a medium wide angle. So in 35mm terms, that means it's a 35mm lens. It just takes in what the span of the eye tends to take in. And there's something about that, because obviously the wider lens you use, the more width you have, but you start losing the relationship between the foreground and the background. Something about the lens that I use gets absolutely that in what I feel is an extremely natural, it feels like you're not just looking at it, it feels you're part of it. And there's something about what I'm trying to do with this big camera where you're taking the picture of a view of something, but you're also trying to represent, you're very aware of being the viewer, whether you're taking the picture or whether you're viewing it 2 meters wide on the wall. There's a huge amount of detail in the camera, so when you look at the thing, you see all these little bits of detail in the camera, in the print, which white, obviously, but of back streets of Paris. Very few people in there. There were a few that had people, but on the whole, it was just little views, compositions of back streets and things going on. And the word is that what he was doing it for was to provide painters with a sort of background story from which they could then explore their own idea of their own painting. And I've always been intrigued by this idea that you were photographing for something else. We've talked a lot as we've been preparing this talk about the relationship, obviously, between this, we're about one medium to the other, and how we listen and try and understand and are informed and influenced by other practices. And there's something about photography, particularly using this big camera, that is so acute and so visually as it was. Now, of course, it's so acute that I find there's something fascinating about no abstraction whatsoever. Now, of course, that's not wholly true, because when you print the picture, you have the opportunity of changing it a tiny bit. You know, you could have the yellow or whatever. You can turn up, you can dial things up, you can darken bits and lighten bits. On the whole, until very recently, I have really, really tried not to do any of that, because I'm fascinated by this absolute thing that really what I'm trying to put across is vision, not an interpretation at all. It's just what. So if we were all there, we would have all seen exactly that. Now, since about the last 8 years, I have started to draw as well. And that was slightly, possibly, I'm not entirely sure about this, but in response to that idea that the big camera just dealt with vision. And I sort of, over the years of being, thinking creatively and whatever, I was happy with that process of the 10/8, but I don't know, I suddenly became, oh, I do apologise. Yes, Mike, can I have the next slide, please? I'm changing it on my computer here, but not up. And the idea of these drawings is that they are the opposite, in that they are just gestures. This one has got 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. Embarrassingly, some of them are really just one line. They're all salt marsh. There are a few that I do of rivers, but on the whole, certainly the ones here are all salt marsh. And I am still obsessed by how a single line can become and represent something that the big camera can't do. And in order to get that right, it needs to have a measure of intention, yes, but also a measure of serendipity or circumstance, just convenient. It has to be slightly casual. Next slide, please, Mike. And here, so this is a picture of Scald Head. High tide, probably, I guess. I mean, any of us who know it, hopefully, will see what I'm trying to do here. And the other thing that's important is that where the photograph is obviously about there, you're in the place, it represents absolutely what you see. I can't do these, I can't do the drawings out there. I have to do, the best ones I've done was when I'm in India or in Egypt, when I'm yearning for the place. Because they are all sort of, they're not representative in a literal sense. They're just really the amalgamation of a distillation of a whole bunch of a lifetime spent out there. Next one. Oh no, before that, I'm going to read a quick, short bit of a Ted Hughes poem, who's always been very influential to me. I find him very visual in the way he does, where he writes. And this is a little bit of a poem called The Horses. And you may be familiar with it, but at dawn he walks up the hill through a wood. I've always seen it as up to the moor, up top where there are no trees. And it's cold, dark, cold. And he gets to the top, and as he's walking up, just as he breaks through onto the moor, he goes past these horses who are, what is the rest line? Dense grey, 10 together, megaliths still. And this bit is when he's come back down the hill and he comes past the horses again. And he goes, stumbling in the fever of a dream, down towards the dark woods from the kindling tops, and came to the horses. There, still they stood, but now steaming and glistening under the flow of light. Their draped stone manes, their tilted hind hooves, stirring under a thaw, while all around them the frost showed its fires. But still they made no sound, not one snorted or stamped. Their hung heads patient as the horizons, high over valleys in the red levelling rays. And with that, next one please, Mike. Red levelling rays, dawn, is a major thing for me. I've always liked to photograph in the morning, prefer the morning, don't really like photographing in the evening. Morning has prospect, sense of feeling that something's going to happen. And I'm intrigued generally about how a photograph can have the capacity to offer something up that might be about to happen, rather than necessarily what usually photography is about, dare I say, which is about something that has happened. So dawn is the right thing. This is a new series I'm doing about dawns across the North Sea when just before when the sun is making its first presence. So what I've been trying to do, I was talking earlier about the idea of how you use the camera to feel part of a place. And I've become intrigued recently about how big you can push that, how much space can you actually feel part of. And this, this is on the cliffs around the coast by Cromer. And I'm just intrigued by, and it seems to be you can get it pretty big and still feel a level of communication with the place that you're looking at. Anyway, shut up now. Polly.
Well, since you've just been... Hello, everyone. I'm here at the Maltings and wherever you might be. As Harry's just mentioned, taking photos in the morning, I actually asked you the other day, why do so many photographers use the morning? And he said there's a whole lot more moisture in the air, which makes a sort of a clarity of the photograph. Is that right?
Well, I think the idea is that in the morning you've got the moisture in the air, which allows for a stronger sense of distance.
Yes.
So anything in the foreground has less moisture in it, so it looks closer.
Yes. Whereas
the distance is faded away into mistiness. That can happen in the evening, but it happens more.
Yeah. Listening to Sally's words and hearing what Harry had to say made me think of what I heard about Louise Gluck the other day, which is how she pushed language until it buckled to release dark energy. And I could feel the energy in your words, Sally, and your pictures. May we have the next slide, please? This is Gymnast, and really what I'm after is energy. Thank you, Harry. What I want is the feeling that there's sort of inner energy through sort of tension and balance. And it's the stretch of the figure that interests me more than you can see than her anatomy. The sort of reason for this subject was that it's actually on the terrace in front of a graduate wing of a university college. And my thought was the college stretches the mind, so I'll give them a sculpture that stretches the body. But you can see it's the simplicity, and also if you look at it, you can see that the whole shape, it was actually a 4-ton boulder that I was presented with. And I've almost turned it subconsciously into a pebble, because I think the taut shapes, the way, the curve on the outside of a pebble that's been naturally weathered, and which we encounter all the time, is just so full of energy. It's hard to beat. All the 6 slides that I'm going to show today are for specific sites, the sculptures, and which, it seems is a slightly different meaning of place than the poet and the photographer have. Because I have to think of the place in mind, who's going to encounter this work. Maybe we have the next slide, please, Mike. Right, this is Father Thames, and let me see. This is actually the first narrative sculpture that I did. It's about, if I'm allowed to speak in feet and inches, it's about just over 7 foot tall, so it's quite a big sculpture. And before doing this job, I'd actually read Robert Gibbing's Sweet Thames Run Softly, in which he made a homemade punt, and he followed, on the eve of the Second World War actually, slowly went downstream on the Thames from as close to the source as he could, making notes of all the creatures and happenings as he followed his route. And I have tried to do this with Father Thames. So I've shown you his back view, and over his left shoulder there's a picture which actually is the source of the river. And the river sort of widens and flows round, spirals round him until it reaches the sea by his feet. And I've used the sort of texturing of, because I tend to hand chisel, the texturing of the stone to show the water. And if you look carefully or go round it, you can find up near the source there are little minnows carved into the stone. and you follow it along, you can quite clearly, I think, see 4 eels tucked in the water there. I actually had great fun. A local fishmonger gave me some eels to study. And I sort of watched them carefully, and then the family and I went down to the river at Greenwich and popped them back in the river in the evening. So we didn't actually hurt them. And then right at the bottom by his feet, there are starfish, and of course, again, local starfish.
So, Polly, where is that?
That is on the bank of the river. There was a development, free trade wharf, and they wanted something that had some connection with the river. They actually had 4 sculptures on the site at the same time as the big block of flats there. It's near Wapping. Right, may we have the next slide, please, Mike? So this is, done in my own way, it's actually a representation of 2 rugby players. And had the nice sloe gin passed around in the bottles when we were all shivering, and then went to the bar afterwards, and the forwards would nudge me and the backs would nudge me, so it would all wanting to be represented. So in order to get the spirit of the club, what I've done is I've done a back and a forward. You can see one figure is about to get a try, and the other figure is about to tackle him. And you can, in the bar afterwards, it's actually where the drinks are in the main bar, they can sort of decide who wins, either he gets his try or he gets his tackle or fight over it. You can decide yourselves which you think happens. It's about this size, just under 1 metre, and I made it in plaster, and it was cast in bronze, but the actual studs that you can see were real studs. So, may I have the next story, please? Next slide. Now, people often say they don't understand sculpture, and they try to think what it could be. What I'd like to think is that people make up their own minds and see what they want to see, because it should stand in its own right. This is actually, but you don't need to know it, representing a life. It was, the request for the sculpture was to mark an individual family member who had died, but they wanted it to be abstract. So I sort of read all the obituaries and learned what I could about this person. And then, this is at 2.5 meters high, it's quite a big sculpture. I knew the site where it was going to go in the garden, and they wanted the children to be able to interact with it. So I put all these together, and I found that the person was a Leo, so it's based on the astrological sign for Leo. And he'd also been offered a place to play the violin in the Royal Academy of Music. So the sort of the curled end is to show his musical side. And then the sort of tension and twist in the main body is to show how smart a businessman he was. Because, so, you know, all the time, of course, we're going to talk about light after, but I have to be, I think of light all the time, the shadows that it will make, the forms, because, of course, sculpture being 3-dimensional, it has to work wherever you are. I mean, you don't normally, sometimes you have a front and a back, but with a solid 3-dimensional thing like this, it has to work all the time, and it has to work as the sun moves round and you see the shadows forming in different ways. Also, of course, with any sculpture like of this size, you have a whole of considerations like health and safety, stability. This doesn't apply so much on this, but you don't want water to stay on it for the damage that water can do. But when I do the sculpture, I try to make all those things just merge in without your sort of being aware of them. Right, yes, may we have the next one, please? Right, now that one was about the representing a life. This one is actually about the creation of a life. It is about 3 meters big. It's quite a long sculpture. The stone was 2 ton, and the quarry, which was Ham Hill Quarry, were very good the way they agreed to see if they could find low down in the quarry a single bit of stone that size. And it's up in the Welsh Hills. So I did a bit of research and I discovered the Mabinogion, which some of you may know, in which all the Celtic stories which had been handed down generation after generation were put into print. And I found this story in which Gwydion, the Welsh hero, thinks it's time that his favourite nephew gets married. So he looks around, but he can't find any girl he thinks is sufficiently beautiful. So he decides to create her. So this is the moment that I'm trying to depict, the very moment of creation. I've sort of, where I was working, you had the flowers of broom, meadowsweet and oak all around. So I was able to get samples of those and simplify them. They're all represented because this is in the Mabinogion. You're told that he creates her out of the flowers of meadowsweet, broom and oak. And in Gwydion's left hand, I sort of decided to do a wheel of creation. And the model for that was the wheel of a sheep's trolley I found in the field. And it was rather fun because the room was built around the sculpture, in fact, which is part of the big fireplace there was. So the sheep, to begin with, the sheep would be looking at me as I carved. Right, yes.
Next one, please.
Yes, may we have the next one, please? And this brings us back to where we are now, the maltings. Those of you who are here might have seen it if you came in the back entrance. Is the timer right, sir?
Yep, all good.
Right. It was part of an art trail, 17 sculptures to mark the opening of this building. And several of them are still around. You'll find in different places. This one, Welk, marks the historic value of Welks in this town. And I actually often think that they're more beautiful when they're battered and bleached. And it also serves the purpose, if you have windows in them, of connecting up the different spaces. So because the light showing right through, you can see in that slide. So in fact, the energy hopefully both goes out from this. I tried to make it almost feel moving, keeping the tension going. This was built on a welded steel frame, spiral, then plaster, then it was cast into resin with brass powder that actually matches the plates on the building. And there's no way I could have done this without a team. It was actually, I mean, one of the fun things about it was it became a community sculpture. The person, Nick Brooks, who cast it, made a mould of 23 pieces that he then had to reassemble. So, I mean, he said it was one of the most challenging tasks he'd done.
I can remember Polly picking up Welsh shells on Sculpted Island 50 years ago.
I still do. And I mean, if you look carefully on the large whirl, you can see a texture. I haven't really talked about texture. I mean, in this short time, we can't cover everything. But it was sort of the icing on the cake as a community project in that 5 children of different sizes, so of different sizes hands, climbed up the scaffolding where I was working it and ran their fingers along the wet plaster to create that texture. So the community really is part of this sculpture. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And
Okay, so we're going to just now sort of it's highly structured this bit, but we're just going to talk about a few key things that sort of bind up what we do. And one of the things that came along right at the beginning when we were talking about our different practices, Sally came up with the word, oh yes, but that's it, phrastic. And I certainly went, sorry, what? Can you explain the word phrastic?
It comes from a Greek word, and Merriam-Webster says, a literary comment on a work of art. An ekphrastic poem describes art through imagination, either an act of narrating or reflecting, like Keats' Ode to a Grecian Urn. But actually about a third of all the poems I write are ekphrastic. The creative thought behind them is probably visual, whether it be the natural world or a work of art. So if it's a painting, a sculpture, or a photograph, the important thing is that it has to go further than the original. Otherwise, it isn't worth writing, you see?
But it's also quite interesting how, visually, I mean, if we take sort of vision or using your eyes, which is obviously highly relevant to all of our practices, but it's also a currency that we use, in Instagram and everything. It's for sharing an idea. The first thing we'll do probably is say, well, look, here's a picture of it.
Yes.
It's quite, it's not, it's just communication as much as anything else.
And it's about the word vision that you used before. What about light being important to us all, especially you?
Yeah, yes, light is, but I think that light is just evocative and it's just entrancing. We kind of react to it in a way that we don't fully understand. We quite like that, there's something, sunlight in the morning. Why? Why is that? Why are we uplifted by it? I don't know.
But it's crucial in sculpture because light is what really shows you the third dimension. And if a sculpture is outside, one has to think very carefully of how the light during the day will change what that sculpture looks like too.
We talked about as well, didn't we, that thing of when I've done a sculpture tread or two and you happen to be late in the evening and you come across a sculpture that you haven't seen, and that slow revelation of it in a gloaming is quite a thing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
So it's not when it's sort of lit, full lit sunshine.
Oh, you can see it silhouetted or actually as its solid form, yes. It totally changes where the light is. And also the texture relies on the light to pick out the carving, how deep you are marking into the stone or whatever material you're using.
I guess a poet could use the word completely metaphorically. You're the light of my life, or something like that. Associations are not necessarily visual at all, but light is used all the time.
But it's also kind of, light is a transient thing, isn't it? Light changes, particularly, in our modern world with electric light where we can just turn it on. But I mean, it was something that it came with the day and went with the night. But all of our practices are really somehow to try and give it continuity and light in the dark.
Yeah, but Harry, there are a lot of people who now, sculptors, who are light sculptures. Their sculpture is the play of light.
True.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, like Tyrrell.
Yes.
So I'm sure some people here went to the Tyrrell exhibition at Houghton a few years ago. It was amazing.
Well, the Capot too.
Yes.
Salt marsh.
Salt marsh is something that affects us all. I mean, we all immediately think of, I think of this coast.
And why? So what is this mad love that we all have for something that's quite flat, quite muddy, and slippery and quite annoying? Why?
When I think of Overy, we did come here as little children, I might say, in 1947, Paul and I. And when I think of what Overy meant to me, I'm coming from Scolt Head over the Cockle Path, and I'm through all those marshes on the Cockle Path. In those days, there were 5 very ugly sort of crossings. There were great big bits of stones, and you had to walk on the flat bit, or they hurt your feet. But I remember walking it and running it, because we'd forget the water bucket, and we had to go back for the water bottle. and running it so many times. And I think that's probably my most amazing. I mean, that draws me more back to Overy than anything.
But Sal, don't you think, I mean, each of us in our own way is economising in the material that we have. And these great big skies and sort of the simplicity of the landscape. I mean, yes, there's all the detail there, but the basic forms are really simple. And I think that maybe that sort of feeds into all of us.
But also, I think there's a pulse, there's a tide, and that,
Yes.
creatively, it works very nicely. When we, most of our time, we would like to live a simpler life, and to have something that just that has a pace, that twice a day, the tide comes in, tide goes out. That's quite a nice environment within which to live and work, it seems to me. That's well, we were going to mention physicality.
Physicality, because that's so important to Polly.
Yeah.
Well, it
You have
is. And of course, I've been talking about the media that I normally use, but whatever medium you're using, the presence of the object, the feeling of touch, which is sort of specific for sculpture, really, unless you're doing cookery and things like that. I think that is really a key thing. And I was actually talking on Zoom with someone who works with pewter a couple of nights ago. And she talked about, as she hammers the sheet of pewter with a nylon hammer, she feels she's having a conversation with it. And I thought that was a lovely way of putting it, because as I chip stone, that's very much what I'm doing. And sometimes the hand sort of just goes into auto as one chips, and it's a very special feeling. I don't know, sometimes the words must flow to you in the same way.
I think we might end now with
The next one, please.
Sally's got something to read you now.
Right. It's not up there.
Oh, sorry. I feel I'm doing it from here.
Yes. We should have a very well-known church with an amazing Norman font. If there's anybody here who doesn't know it, you must haste there tomorrow. Below a frieze of lions and vines, there's a carved figure for every month of the year, about which I wrote a pamphlet.
Deepdale.
Yes, it's St Mary's, Burnham Deepdale, called simply Font. And I tried to get inside the carver, who thought, like everybody else then, that this life was entirely a preparation for the next one. So there always this slant I had in my mind. And thank you for the next one.
Next one, please.
I chose, obviously, the slide for October. Can you see it properly? Doesn't it? Right. And he's filtering wine into containers. And I thought that was a good one to read during COVID. But he was getting ready for the winter. And I wrote, I'm going to read you the poem in font for October. Filling. The poetry of the dead is in our bones. Up it comes from the depths of silence for celebration. God flows like a breeze through fields picked clean. Forgotten odours stir the stalks. Vigorous man, stocked up with grain, there he is filtering wine, his satisfaction in routine. He prepares for the sacraments, body and blood. He offers thanks for the remission of sins. One night, the sky cracks round him and thunder rolls across October fields. He steals the casks and rolls in drunk. He's singing hymns. I remember thinking about I wondered what to do with that poem, and I was walking on that little path that runs from the end of Overy down to the Norton Wall. You know that field, which is sometimes it's just a little narrow. Last year there was very high corn, and there was just a little narrow path that you could go through all the way down. And I was there when I made that decision.
Well, it's a beautiful poem. So.
Yes.
There we go. That's us done for the moment. Any questions? Dominic?
I have a question specifically wanting to address what you said, that when you put your Gandolfini Gandolfi camera, and then we have this fantastic view. And at that moment, if we were all standing there, we would see the same thing.
Mhm.
I don't think
You question that, do you?
I don't think that's
Okay,
true.
so,
I think that we all see different things when we look at all of your different art. We hear different things, we see different things, we feel different.
Okay, so just for those who couldn't hear what Dominic said, that he is disputing very reasonably whether or not, when I take a picture, the comment that I said would that if we were all standing there, we would all see it. His point being that surely we all see different things in different spaces. Correct, yes, absolutely understood. But it's still quite a point. I think that doesn't change the practice. And the practice is to try and get a view that is universal and quite democratic. I mean, I understand it's completely personal, and I'm usually very much by myself in these places. But at the same time, I'm trying, it's what I'm endeavouring to do is to replicate a view that isn't complicated, that is just simply, photography has the one thing that doesn't need any further information. It doesn't necessarily even need a caption. It's very clear what you're trying to do. And that's why Miranda, my wife, and I, we talk an awful lot about how, how fun it is to take pictures and landscape pictures, but not tell you where it is. So often the first thing that people want to know is, where is that? But it's really satisfying stripping that out. It really doesn't matter. Now, I understand personally why, someone might want to know, gosh, is that the place that I remember it is? And I understand that. But I think it's part of what I'm trying to do, which is go, really doesn't matter. You'll enjoy it more if you take that out. And whether that ties in with what you're saying, I don't know. But it's certainly an attempt to democratise.
Could it link with what John G. Driver was saying last night about the place that belongs to no one?
Yeah, well, yes, very good point.
Yes.
I mean, we particularly here, there's something we haven't talked about so much, about how there's something very universal, and we all. I know the place is steeped in nostalgia for a lot of people, and we all have connections that go way back, grandparents, whatever. But on the whole, you're never quite sure who owns it. You're never quite sure who it belongs to. And that's very satisfying. You certainly don't feel as if there's clearly Mr. Big who owns this place, and if you get it wrong, you'll be chucked off.
We have a couple of questions from the online audience. First of all, because you had a little bit of a problem with the sound when everybody came on at first, and somebody I think we missed Sally's second poem. Could you perhaps read it again?
Good, yes.
Shall I read it now?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just trying to remember the second one.
So, will everyone be heard?
Picture of a Tabble.
question was?
My Daisies was the second poem. Picture of a Tabble.
I think you should read both, actually.
Yeah.
What am I saying?
Well, look, the first one was Sundry Pelts, and the second one was Picture of a Tabble.
Do both.
Do both. So, Sundry Pelts
Third
first.
one, I think.
But the third one, I can't read three, so just a minute. The third one.
The third one.
Oh, the third one was Ionides painting.
No, it was the man walking.
Oh, the man
Man
walking.
Yes.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Ask for third. Let's have
The
third.
third one. Walking man. If we could possibly have the photo again, it would be terrific. I don't know.
Second and third now.
Okay. So let's start off with the second. Let's do Tabble and Walking Man.
Picture of a Tabble was second, because that's
Number four, mate.
that's my Daisy.
Number four.
My oldest granddaughter's.
Yeah.
Okay, my oldest granddaughter's painting. Drawing at our table when I was sitting round, and her mother wanted to have words with her and ask her why she wasn't including everybody else in the picture. The slab of white marble. Maple extends the room to 3 generations, fills most of a page. 2 stylized girls, triangular bodies, inscrutable grins, float isolated at opposite ends. Daisy, the elder, draws herself slightly bigger, though she no longer is. Behind her, an empty chair, arms like the Brancusi hugs, She needs and receives, but aren't enough. Cries strangle the afternoon. Her eyes are harsh as a wounded woman. We'll have to talk, my daughter says. She's back to pin men. Daisy, we all eat together. Where are we all? She rolls crayon into anonymous, unthreatening gatherings. Dances flowers at a picture of a tabble. Everything else against the grain, a hurt that won't be damped, a tummy pain.
Terrific.
And
Should we do the man?
the
I
other
think we
one
should.
was the walking man?
Yep, yes please.
Was it? Or the next one?
We'll do
Walking man.
Walking man?
The walking.
Second and third, so.
Yep,
Second
walking
and
man.
third.
Yes.
Okay. Ah, right, George Fullard, and you know all about him now. Look at those hands. Look at his. He was remembering because the details about his experience he wrote down in a casual way. But I think the picture, to me, the feet and the hands say so much. It's like Polly's sculptures. Polly has these great Epstein fingers on her sculptures that say so much. Walking man. He's leaning back, although he's moving forwards. So inclined, he doesn't see the ground ahead of him, as if there's contradiction somewhere in this skinny man in pen and ink, his gaze glazed over, his fuzz of beard smeared on, his hands alarmed, as if the contradiction tilts him back. The part still driven by the wind and beaten by the rain, the sun full on his face, paralysed by the luck that keeps him going. He's not exactly fragile, though there is that, more obsessed by battling the winter line, the line that felled him when the shell hit. The tank brewed up, his words, as he was getting out, the pain as he came down, before they stitched him up and bore him home in silence. He landed without a holdall, only the blast inside his head, baggage sticky tape to his brain. With perfect clarity, he sees Monte Cassino, the ruins on the hill, icy mountain ranges, rivers and ravines, a terrain crying out for endurance. Still, there is courage in his feet, one after the other.
Lovely.
Great. Yeah, okay.
Are there any more questions?
There are some more questions.
Oh, go on, let's have
Oh, let's have the questions, Ron.
Right, there's a couple here. So, what is Polly's favourite material to work with?
The question, shall I repeat that just before anyone can't hear? What is Polly's favourite material to work with?
My natural material is stone, but I love the fact that I've had the opportunity to work in other materials because you can do all sorts of things with other materials that you actually can't do in stone.
The last question.
Yes.
And another question, have the three of you tried anything new creatively during lockdown?
Oh,
Well, I've just written a poem, and when you've written a poem, you want to know immediately whether it's as good as you think it is, because you always think your last poem is absolutely terrific, just for a little while.
Yeah.
So what I do is I send it off to a very good friend who lives in Norwich. We've had endless problem with AOL since I was hacked. So this has been rather painful. I think I did finally manage to get it off to him this morning, and he comes back to me on WhatsApp saying, yes, I've received your...
without judgment yet.
Yes. I haven't yet heard his comments on it.
God, terrifying.
What about you, Cory?
Well, I might say creative cookery.
Good,
Well, someone has said that cookery is the finest art of all because it's the only thing that calls on all five senses, which actually is quite interesting to think about.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I've got that. I've started doing reliefs with pastel sort of boards, trying to do slightly what the line does, but with physical objects. So, not sure yet, but that's what I've been trying to do.
I mean, one experiments all the time. That's half the fun of being in the arts, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And one goes on learning all the time. You never stop learning.
No.
And we haven't brought music in today. But of course, that's another art. There's so many arts that could be included today.
Sure.
I'm going to read a final poem, but it's got marshes and light and shell in, and it's another one from Font. And in this one, it's not very long, and it's in the words as if I was the carver. Still lives. 12 times, stonemason, you carved round a scooped up square of stone until the end met the beginning. Your calendar shimmied through arcades of shade and sun. The font became functional, and something like gold falling through water restored the men and women and the children who survived. You saw demons haunt the marshes, while the tower's roundness wrapped the night and every dusty morning. I wouldn't swap my world for what's resurrected below a frieze of lions and vines, something that shattered and healed 1,000 times. When you gave birth to craft that blessed this place, you saw the light lie evenly on the ground. Then, in the shine of perpetual sun, you withdrew into the silence where God waits and judges. This curious silence is held within the Barnack limestone font, hoarded as if in a great shell.
Terrific. Thank you, everybody, very much indeed. On behalf of Polly and Sally and I,
Yes,
thank you so much for coming.
We know all because we've been sending Zooms to people, we know all the things that people do at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon that they put before Zoom, so we think it's very, very good of you to give up your afternoon to come here.
Yeah.
But it will be available on YouTube once the festival is over.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
and
Yes,
Mike.
yes.
It's been wonderful.
It's been a bit of a distance.
You did well.
I've got copies of this, which is the story. My aunt, Ione, who drew the picture, there's a picture of her in the middle. And the end of that story is that actually after jumping off a high cliff, she spent the rest of her life in a mental hospital. And this book is sold for the Mental Health Foundation, and it's only £6. That one, I've got a couple of each if anybody's interested. That one's £10. It doesn't matter if none of you, some of you got it already.
Can I just point out, but Derek,
My father.
your father,
Yes.
set up.
Oh yes, he's the little one there, and he set up the Mental Health Foundation in 1949 as a result of, in fact, both independently, both his sister and his brother came out of this high-achieving, stressed family that they were.
And Harry, you have books too, don't you?
I have a marsh book. So if anyone wants a marsh book here, it is a mixture of black and white photographs of the marsh and drawings. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Have you got one next time?
Well, I was going to say, no, that sometimes I discovered that Harry does actually place a fish on the ground and then take a photo.
Yes. I'm not, no, it doesn't all just. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's lots of thanks coming from the online audience as well.
We've got lots of thanks from the online audience.